Hi, I'm Steve D'Antonio. I'm in the lazarette of this boat, and I'm going to talk a little bit about steering systems. This vessel has a hydraulic steering system. These are very common on most larger boats from the 30 feet and up range. It uses a hydraulic ram that acts on a set of tiller arms, which are these in this boat. Because it's a twin screw, we've got two rudders. Each has a tiller arm attached to it, and then there's a tie rod or tie bar between them that is then attached to the hydraulic ram. When you turn the wheel essentially is a hydraulic pump. It's pumping fluid into this cylinder and causing this ram to move in one direction or the other. Again, that acts on these tiller arms and allows you to steer the boat. There's a number of things down here that are worth looking at on your boat from time to time. I would say it's important to do regular inspections on steering systems because there's a lot of moving parts. They wear out, they become loose, they can break and fail. So it's important to look at these on a fairly regular basis. What I'd like you to start out with is looking at the parts that pivot or move. And those would be these pins here that connect the tie bar to the tiller arm. And then another pin or a bolt in this case that connects the hydraulic ram to the tie bar. All of these parts are experiencing some level of wear whenever you steer the boat, so those need to be looked at. And I would say that if yours have never been removed and inspected, then that's worth doing, especially if the boat is older, because the part that wears is essentially hidden. You can't see it inside of here. And the outside, the ends that you can see might look perfectly fine, but in fact the part in the middle may be wearing heavily. So we want to look at those. We want to look at this pin or bolt that is connecting the ram to the tie bar also. And it's very important that if this is a bolt, that it include two features. One is this large washer. And this washer prevents the ram from separating from the tie bar if the innards of this pivot point ever fail. If they break, we want to make sure that these two parts still stay connected together. And this oversized washer, even though it may look wrong, in fact it's the right way to do it, we want to make sure that that large washer is present. If it's not, this whole piece can fall through and the ram can separate from the tiller arm. The other important part of this is we want to make sure that if this is a bolt, that it has threads showing on this end of the nut down here. This nut is a special nut. It includes a locking mechanism. Sometimes it's called a nylock nut because it has nylon embedded in the end of the nut, which prevents the nut from unscrewing itself essentially. Well, if we don't have enough threads poking through this side of the nut, that locking mechanism doesn't work. And in many cases, in inspections that I do, I find a nut here, but I can't see the bolt. I can't see any of the threads. That makes me concerned. I wonder, is the nut actually locking or engaging with the threads on the bolt? If you can't see those threads, then it's probably not. The rule is there should be a minimum of 2 threads down here. So look at yours to make sure you have that. Another area that is worth looking at and a place where I frequently find problems is this locking nut that essentially locks the ram to this pivoting head. This is threaded, it screws into this part, and this nut locks the two together. Well, in many cases I find this nut loose, and if it is loose, what will happen is this ram will slowly unscrew itself over time, and it may take hundreds of hours to do this, and eventually separate from this pivoting head. If that happens, you have no more steering. You'll turn the wheel, the ram will move, but it won't be connected to the rudders anymore. So we don't want to take a chance that that happens. So make sure that you can put your fingers on that nut and that it's tight. Other hardware that we want to look at are the fasteners that secure the ram to the boat essentially. So these should be through bolts. You should be able to see or at least feel the other side of these. Put your fingers on the side that comes through where the nut is to make sure everything is tight. What I like to do is, while the boat is underway, do some slow turns from what we would call lock to lock, as hard over as you can turn from one direction until the wheel won't go any further. Stay there for a few seconds, then rotate, go all the way over to the other direction as far as the wheel will go. If you're down here while that's being done, you can look for movement in any of these components that's not supposed to be there. Clearly, we wouldn't want the base of this ram to move independently of the boat. The two should be locked together with these fasteners. But if you see shifting or movement or rocking there during that steering test, then you know that there's something wrong. Another area we want to look at when we're putting some load on the system is the attachment between the tiller arms and the rudder shaft. There should be no movement independently. Those two should always move together. So if you're watching that and you see even the smallest amount of movement in this tiller arm rather, that is independent of the rudder shaft, then that's a problem. It means these fasteners might be loose. It means that the bore in the tiller arm might be too big and they can never be tightened properly. A variety of things could be going on there, but we want to make sure that that is not occurring. We want to look carefully at that part of the system. Another component that we have here, and most boats also have, is a pump for the automatic pilot. So this pump enables the boat to be steered from the hydraulic steering system without a separate ram. It uses the boat's own ram, and it takes commands from the automatic pilot or the autopilot. All very typical, but in order for this to be installed properly and in compliance with most autopilot manufacturer instructions, we need to have 3 isolation valves that enable us to isolate this pump from the steering system if the pump develops a leak. In this case, the valves are present. There's one here and then 2 back here. And so if we had a leak on this pump, we could close all of those valves. The pump would stop leaking. We'd still have steering. So we'd be good to go in that case. While you're down in this area during the steering test, the underway test, look at the hoses and make sure there's no chafe between the hoses and other parts of the boat, or maybe between the hoses themselves, between the hoses. We don't want to have any parts that are wearing against each other, essentially. And we want to make sure nothing's interfering with the steering system. If you've got gear stored down here and it's an exposed system like this, make sure nothing's leaning up against it or there's no chance of anything falling into it. I kind of like an exposed system because it's very easy to do a casual inspection on it. Every time you come down into the space, you can eyeball this and look for anything that might be out of the ordinary. If it's boxed up and covered up, that's a little bit harder to do. The cover does prevent gear and other things from falling into it, but again, if you're careful about that, I consider that less of a problem, and the ability to do an inspection each time you stick your head down here to be more valuable in that respect. So this is set up well. I like the way this system is done. Another area worth mentioning on these systems obviously is fluid. Because they use hydraulic fluid, we want to look for any evidence of leakage, particularly at the ram and at the fittings here as well. There should be none. No amount of leakage is normal. Very little bit of wetness on the end of the ram might be normal, but if it's enough to drip, then that's probably too much. We probably have a seal that's failing here and should be thinking about replacing the ram or at least rebuilding it and changing that seal. If the vessel has the capability of being steered by an automatic, or I'm sorry, not an automatic pilot, but a tiller arm, a manual tiller, one that you would use out on deck if you had a major steering failure, then fit that tiller arm to make sure that it actually engages the rudder and then actually steer the boat with it, or at the very least move the rudders with it. In many cases, in order for that to work with a hydraulic system, you cannot push a rudder manually against a hydraulic system. The system will not allow you to do that. However, if the system has a bypass valve, then you're able to do that. So if you have a hydraulic steering system, if you have the ability to steer with a manual tiller, then make sure you know where your bypass valve is. It should be labeled. Under normal conditions, it will be turned off. It will not be allowing fluid to flow. However, if you need to steer the boat with a manual tiller, then that valve would be opened and it would allow you to move the rudders back and forth, and it would allow fluid to move through the ram that otherwise would not move under normal conditions. One final area on hydraulic systems, or one final component, it's optional, but many systems do have one of these. It's called the pressure reservoir. The pressure reservoir maintains a head of air, or essentially air pressure, against the hydraulic fluid in the system. The purpose of that is to reduce the likelihood of air being drawn into the system. If a leak develops, that air will push fluid out of the reservoir and to the leak. Hopefully you will notice that leak and fix it before the reservoir empties out. Without that system, air could be drawn into the steering system, and that is very difficult to get out of the system, and it makes the steering start to malfunction. It feels very sloppy or mushy. So the pressure reservoir, and this vessel has one right here, you can see that it has a pressure gauge on it, and it has a sight glass that shows you the level of the fluid inside of it. Typically these are somewhere between 25 and 30 psi, but check your system because it could differ. This is where fluid would be added, and this is where you would add pressure to the system with an air pump or a bicycle pump to make sure that it maintains that head of air that's pushing down on the fluid in the reservoir and making sure that air can't be drawn into the system. Steering systems obviously are a very important part of any vessel. I'd consider it one of the key or critical systems. Therefore, excuse me, you should be looking at it on a regular basis. Again, every time you come into this space, don't waste that opportunity. Look around, make sure there are no loose or wearing components. Make sure you have no leaks, obviously. And make sure if you have a manual tiller that you at least fit it and try it. Make sure that it works so that if you do need it, you'll know it'll be there for you.